Welcome to Read Aloud with me, Dan. Hi, how are you? Oh, right. You're listening to the video. You can't respond. We're gonna read chapter 3 here of Stalin's. We just read Lenin's book. Stalin's Marxism and the National Question. You can find previous recordings of this reading on Twitch and maybe YouTube. I don't know what I'm going to do with that. We'll figure that out later. But this is chapter 3. In chapter 3, the central question is, what form should the national program take in any given nation or state? What's best for the toiling masses? Is it autonomy? Is it federation? Is it secession? Is secession best for the nation? Stalin gives a couple different examples. He'll talk about the Bund solving, quote unquote, the national question by borrowing the Austrian national program of autonomy, the Austrian SACDEM program, Social Democrats program of autonomy, but they're doing it without looking at the concrete historical conditions. Stalin explains how they do so. He gives the comparison of Austria and Russia. Should the national program be the same? Should the national program of the Social Democrats of these two nations be the same? And he contrasts the Austrian Social Democrats' petty reformism versus the Russian Social Democrats' radical change. Due to the differences in the conditions and immediate tasks. That is a brief summary of chapter 3 of Stalin's Marxism and the National Question. Chapter 3, presentation of the question. And we read. Stalin says, a nation has the right freely to determine its own destiny. A nation. Dan, does that mean a state has the right to freely determine its own destiny? No. Nations, honey, nations, they're different than states. Sometimes a nation will become a state, as was described in chapter 2. A nation has the right to arrange its life as it sees fit, without, of course, trampling on the rights of other nations. That's beyond dispute. What is that reminding you of? Settler colonial nations. Obviously, Israel comes to mind. But obviously, the place that I live, the so-called United States, comes to mind. Reading on. But how exactly should it, a nation, arrange its own life? What forms should its future constitution take? If the interests of the majority of the nation, and above all, of the proletariat, are to be borne in mind. He's framing the question, what should a nation do? It's got the right to do what it wants, as long as it's not, restricting other nations' ability to do what they want. But what should they do? He frames it, if the interests of the majority of the nation. You notice how he doesn't say, it's in the interest of the state or something like that. What the fuck does that mean? Why is it when things are in the nation, in the interests of the nation, it doesn't help me? Right? Oh, look, the economy goes up. The big line goes up. That's in the interest of the state. Well, why doesn't my bank account get bigger when the big line goes up? Anyways, you get the idea. Reading on. A nation has the right to arrange its life on autonomous lines. It even has the right to secede. But this does not mean that it should do so under all circumstances, that autonomy or separation will everywhere and always be advantageous for a nation, that is, for its majority. I like how he keeps coming back to that. That is, for the toiling strata. The Transcaucasian Tatars, not really, the Tatars, as a nation, may assemble, let us say, in their diet. I think we do say diet. And I did some looking up of the term, but I don't have my text right next to me. Where is it? Chet is reminding us of what's happening in Kashmir right now. Absolutely. Yeah. Thanks for bearing with me here. Chapter 3, a diet. I learned all about this. In the Holy Roman Empire, the diet, or maybe some people say diet, I don't really know. The diet was the deliberative body of the empire. A diet generally refers to a legislative body or a deliberative assembly. It's a historical term derived from the Latin diete, diaeta, and later dieta, which originally meant a regimen or a way of life, and also came to signify a meeting or assembly. And then, of course, comes to signify, what you eat, your way of life. A diet. Again, the Transcaucasian Tatars, or Tatars as a nation, may assemble, let us say, in their diet, and succumbing to the influence of their beys and mullahs, decide to restore the old order of things and to secede from the state. According to the meaning of the clause on self-determination, they are fully entitled to do so. But this will be in the interests. But will this be in the interest of the toiling strata of the Tatar nation? Can social democracy look on indifferently when the beys and mullahs assume the leadership of the masses in the solution of the national question? Should not social democracy interfere in the matter and influence the will of the nation in a definite way? Should it not come forward with a definite plan for the solution of the question, a plan which would be most advantageous for the Tatar masses? But what solution would be most compatible with the interests of the toiling masses? Autonomy, federation, or separation? All these are problems the solution of which will depend on the concrete historical conditions in which the given nation finds itself. More than that, conditions, like everything else, change. And a decision which is correct at one particular time may prove to be entirely unsuitable at another. What is it, boys? What are we doing? Where are we dropping today? Are we doing autonomy? Are we doing federation or separation? What's best? What's best for the masses, the toiling masses, the oppressed masses? Well, what are the conditions? Keeping in mind that conditions change. In the middle of the 19th century, Marx was in favor of the secession of Russian Poland, and he was right. For it was then a question of emancipating a higher culture from a lower culture that was destroying it. And the question at that time was not only a theoretical one, an academic question, but a practical one, a question of actual reality. At the end of the 19th century, the Polish Marxists were already declaring that the secession of Poland, declaring against the secession of Poland, and they too were right. During the 50 years that had elapsed, profound changes had taken place, bringing Russia and Poland closer economically and culturally. Moreover, during that period, the question of secession had been converted from a practical matter into a question of academic dispute, which excited nobody except perhaps intellectuals abroad. This, of course, by no means precludes the possibility that certain internal and external conditions may arise in which the question of the secession of Poland may again come on the order of the day. You'll hear no Western leader celebrated by liberals talking about, uh, the right of nations to secede, specifically Poland. And of course, we know the lies that they hurl at Stalin with regards to Poland and World War II and the Nazis and the whole thing. I just think that's incredible. You'll never hear any Western leader talk with any amount of clarity on this topic, but yet here's Stalin, the guy that's villainized by those very same people. Stalin says, the solution of the national question is possible only in connection with the historical conditions taken in their development. The economic, political, and cultural conditions of a given nation constitute the only key to the question how a particular nation ought to arrange its life and what forms its future constitution ought to take. It is possible that a specific solution of the question will be required for each nation. If the dialectical approach to a question is required anywhere, it is required here, in the national question. I'm really stunned, actually, at how all of the texts that we've read are sort of like going towards this. It feels like we're at the top of the pyramid of like Marxist theory here. And it's all been building towards this. And it built an extremely solid foundation through, for me, it built a solid foundation through my study of dialectical materialism, and then historical materialism, and through history, and more and more Marxist theory, political economy stuff. Like, holy moly, it's all been building towards this. It feels like building a pyramid of knowledge. It's incredible. Only materialism can do this for you. Stalin says, in view of this, we must declare our decided opposition to a certain very widespread but very summary manner of solving the national question, which owes its inception to the Bund. We have in mind the easy method of referring to Austrian and South Slav social democracy, which has supposedly already solved the national question, and whose solution the Russian Social Democrats should simply borrow. It's assumed that whatever, say, is right for Austria is also right for Russia. The most important and decisive factor is lost sight of here, namely the concrete historical conditions in Russia as a whole, and in the life of each of the nations inhabiting Russia in particular. So he's referring to the fact that Russia is a multinational state. When do they say that is it Lenin who says it, that Russia is a prison house of nations? When did they get to that? I like that quote. I can't wait. All right. Stalin says, listen, for example, to what the well-known Bundist V. Kosovsky says. When at the Fourth Congress of the Bund, the principles of the question, that is, the national question, were discussed, the proposal made by one of the members of the Congress to settle the question in the spirit of the resolution of the South Slav Social Democratic Party met with general approval. And the result was that the Congress unanimously adopted national autonomy. I think he refers to Russia, but I think it applies to America as well. And Stalin says, and that was all. No analysis of the actual conditions in Russia. No investigation of the condition of the Jews in Russia. They first borrowed the solution of the South Slav Social Democratic Party and then approved it. And finally they unanimously adopted it. This is the way the Bundists present and solve the national question in Russia. God, he's got so much heat for these hack theoreticians, right? It's incredible. He says, as a matter of fact, Austria and Russia represent entirely different conditions. You have to say it, apparently. This explains why the Social Democrats in Austria, when they adopted their national program at Brünn in 1899, in the spirit of the resolution of the South Slav Social Democratic Party, with certain insignificant amendments, it is true, approached the question in an entirely non-Russian way, so to speak, and, of course, solved it in a non-Russian way. First, as to the presentation of the question. How is the question presented by the Austrian theoreticians of cultural national autonomy, the interpreters of the Brünn national program and the resolution of the South Slav Social Democratic Party, Springer and Bauer? Springer. I Americanized it. Springer. Springer says, whether a multinational state is possible, and whether, in particular, the Austrian nationalities are obliged to form a single political entity, is a question we shall not answer here, but shall assume to be settled. For anyone who will not concede this possibility and necessity, our investigation will, of course, be purposeless. Our theme is as follows, inasmuch as these nations are obliged to live together. What legal forms will enable them to live together in the best possible way? Those are Springer's italics. Thus, the starting point is the state integrity of Austria. The starting point of their national program is the state integrity of Austria. Again, they say, inasmuch as these nations are obliged to live together, and their theory is assumed. It's assumed. It's assumed to be settled. Honey, it's not settled. It's not settled. Bauer says the same thing. We therefore start from the assumption that the Austrian nations will remain in the same state union in which they exist at present, and inquire how the nations within this union will arrange their relations among themselves and to the state. They assume these nations will remain in the state indefinitely? What the fuck? I'm sorry. Things change. Nations have the right to national self-determination. I'm sorry, I thought nations had the right to secede. Why is your national program assuming that they don't? Stalin goes on. Here again, the first thing is the integrity of Austria, the state. Can Russian social democracy present the question in this way? No, it cannot. And it cannot because from the very outset, it holds the view of the right of nations to self-determination, by virtue of which a nation has the right of secession. Like I just said. Even the Bundist Goldblatt admitted at the Second Congress of Russian Social Democracy that the latter could not abandon the standpoint of self-determination. Here's what Goldblatt said on that occasion. Nothing can be said against the right of self-determination. If any nation is striving for independence, we must not oppose it. If Poland does not wish to enter into lawful wedlock with Russia, it is not for us to interfere with her. It does feel like they're sort of confusing states and nations, but moving on. All this is true. But it follows that the starting points of the Austrian and Russian Social Democrats, far from being identical, are diametrically opposite. After this, can there be any question of borrowing the national program of the Austrians? Furthermore, the Austrians hope to achieve the freedom of nationalities by means of petty reforms by slow steps, while they propose cultural national autonomy as a practical measure. They do not count on any radical change, on a democratic movement for liberation, which they do not even contemplate. And again, if you're not entirely clear on what cultural national autonomy is, that is precisely what this chapter is about. So you may want to go back to chapter 2 and review. He says, the Russian Marxists, on the other hand, associate the freedom of nationalities with a probable radical change, with a democratic movement for liberation, having no grounds for counting on reforms. And this essentially alters matters in regard to the probable fate of the nations of Russia. Bauer says, of course, there is little probability that national autonomy will be the result of a great decision, of a bold action. Austria will develop towards national autonomy step by step, but a slow process of development in the course of a severe struggle, as a consequence of which legislation and administration will be in a state of chronic paralysis. The new constitution will not be created by a great legislative act, but by a multitude of separate enactments for individual provinces and individual communities. Springer says the same thing. He writes, I am very well aware that institutions of this kind, that is, organs of national autonomy, are not created in a single year or a single decade. The reorganization of the Prussian administration alone took considerable time. It took the Prussians 2 decades finally to establish their basic administrative institutions. Let nobody think that I harbor any illusions as to the time required and the difficulties to be overcome in Austria. All this is very definite. But can the Russian Marxists avoid associating the national question with bold actions? Can they count on partial reforms, on a multitude of separate enactments as a means for achieving the freedom of nationalities? But if they cannot and must not do so, is it not clear that the methods of struggle of the Austrians and the Russians and their prospects must be entirely different? How, in such a state of affairs, can they confine themselves to the one-sided milk and water cultural national autonomy of the Austrians? I don't know what that reference means, milk and water, but it sounds like a dig, you know? Or the other, he says. Either those who are in favor of borrowing do not count on bold actions in Russia, or they do count on such actions, but know not what they do. Finally, the immediate tasks facing Russia and Austria are entirely different and consequently dictate different methods of solving the national question. In Austria, parliamentarism prevails, and under present conditions, no development in Austria is possible without parliament. But parliamentary life and legislation in Austria are frequently brought to a complete standstill by severe conflicts between the national parties. That explains the chronic political crisis from which Austria has for a long time been suffering. Hence, in Austria, the national question is the very hub of political life. It is the vital question. It is therefore not surprising that the Austrian social democratic politicians should first of all try in one way or another to find a solution for the national conflicts, of course on the basis of existing parliamentary system by parliamentary methods. Not so with Russia. In the first place, in Russia, there is no parliament, thank God. In the second place, and this is the main point, the hub of the political life of Russia is not the national, but the agrarian question. Consequently, the fate of the Russian problem, and accordingly the liberation of the nations too, is bound up in Russia with the solution of the agrarian question. That is, with the destruction of the relics of feudalism, that is, with the democratization of the country. That explains why in Russia the national question is not an independent and decisive one, but a part of the general and more important question of the emancipation of the country. Springer writes, the barrenness of the Austrian parliament is due precisely to the fact that every reform gives rise to antagonisms within the national parties which may affect their unity. The leaders of the parties, therefore, avoid everything that smacks of reform. I think this is such a important thing to just like sit and stew on for a second. Because that is an incredibly important analysis. And this is the danger of bourgeois parliamentarism. Let me get to the end of this paragraph here. He says, Springer says, a progress in Austria is generally conceivable only if the nations are granted indefeasible legal rights, which will relieve them of the necessity of constantly maintaining national militant groups in parliament, and will enable them to turn their attention to the solution of economic and social problems. This is one of these things I'm trying to draw people to understand, which is that parliamentarism is dangerous. If reform, which is really what we want, well, really we want revolution, but we take reform, we take little bits, but anytime they try reform, it throws off their whole political calculus of how things work for them, in their favor, and the class they represent, or the wing of the class that they represent. Reform gives rise to antagonisms within their parties. That affects their unity, their ability to like stay together and vote as a bloc. So their leaders, I'm thinking of like Pelosi, I'm thinking of, whatever. These kinds of people, they don't want anything. They just want to keep things the same. Status quo all the time. Nothing really ever changes in that sense. Until there's a boiling point. Reading on, Bauer says the same thing. National peace is indispensable, first of all, for the state. The state cannot permit legislation to be brought to a standstill by the very stupid question of language, or by every quarrel between excited people on a linguistic frontier, or over every new school. All this is clear. But it is no less clear that the national question in Russia is on an entirely different plane. It is not the national, but the agrarian question that decides the fate of progress in Russia. The national question is a subordinate one. And he's showing you his complete grasp of dialectical materialism. This guy is no slouch. I don't think he's quite as astute as Lenin in some ways, but this man is no slouch. He's more thoughtful than any Western leader I've ever had in my lifetime. And really thoughtful on very important questions. Liberals don't have leaders. They have SpongeBob. Reading on. And so, we have different presentations of the question, different prospects and methods of struggle, different immediate tasks. Is it not clear that, such being the state of affairs, only pedants who solve the national question without reference to space and time can think of adopting examples from Austria and of borrowing a program? He's just so devastating. It's just the way that he and Lenin write is devastating to his ideological opponents. He is a good writer. Yeah, he wrote for the masses. He says, to repeat, the concrete historical conditions as the starting point, not the integrity of the state. And the dialectical presentation of the question as the only correct way of presenting it, such is the key to solving the national question. And that brings us to the end of Chapter 3. Presentation of the question. Again, we talked about the central question itself. What form should the national program take in a nation? Autonomy, federation, or secession? We discussed the Bund, solving the national question by borrowing the Austrian national program of cultural national autonomy, doing so without looking at the concrete historical conditions in Russia. And he gets to contrasting the two. In Austria, the main task is organizing the proletariat. The main task is the national program, I should say. In Russia, the main question is the agrarian question. We discussed the Austrian petty reformism versus Russian radical change. And again, the differences in conditions and immediate tasks. That is Chapter 3, presentation of the question. If you enjoyed, you got anything out of this, feel free to support my content. You can support by subscribing on Twitch. You can support via Patreon. You can support on Stream Elements with a tip, or you can tip directly Venmo, Cash App, PayPal. Dan Simpson is my name. That was Chapter 3. If you're watching live, stick around. I think we'll read Chapter 4. Otherwise, like and subscribe, and we'll see you next time in Chapter 4 of Marxism and the National Question, which is... Oh, I got confused. Which is cultural national autonomy. I was mistaken. I thought he wrote about that in Chapter 2. I got confused. So I guess he's going to explain now more in chapter 4 what is that Austrian national program. And he's going to get into that a little bit more, discussing the so-called autonomy of Austria, the so-called autonomy of the Bund. And we're going to get into that. I guess I got confused.